Thank you for having me on the panel. I'll start with a brief framing of the problem at hand and then hand over to my two fellow panelists to discuss the opportunities for content regulation to combat extremism and terrorism online. So as most of you know, nowadays almost every radicalization process and every violent terrorist attack has some online component to it. This can range from communicating with like-minded individuals via the spreading of extremist narratives to the live streaming of terrorist attacks online. The internet is no longer just an arena for extremist activism. It's become a place in which political ideologies are incubated, attacks are conceived, and social movements are made. Social media are the main platforms on which terrorist or extremist activity online takes place. Of course, terrorist organizations still have their own websites, their propaganda publications, such as the Amaq news agency of the so-called Islamic State. But as the Alliance to Counter Crime Online finds, 90% of terrorist activity on the internet takes place on social media networks. It's important to note briefly that radicalization or the perpetration of extremist violent acts rarely occurs entirely online, but it usually also has some form of real-life component as well. So social media is often used as a way to supplement existing face-to-face extremist relationships and networks. However, the role of the traditional recruiters for radicalization has declined with the rise of the internet as a propaganda and radicalization tool, and as terrorist groups have evolved from these hierarchical organizations to more loosely knit networks that have more or less replaced the very strict hierarchical recruitment of Al-Qaeda, for example, for their specialized training camps in the 90s and early 2000s. What we see more and more of, and have seen for some years, are the so-called lone actors who conduct their extremist activities more or less alone, and who are particularly active on social media. One might think of the attacks in Utøya, in Christchurch, or more recently in Hany. Before getting any deeper into the topic, I want to briefly explain what I mean by extremist content, and then look at different forms and characteristics of extremist content online. There are, of course, significant debates about these definitions, which we can't get into today. That would just lead too far. But just pragmatically, for the purpose of this brief input, I want to take extremism to mean the political ideologies that oppose a society's core values and principles. So it's very important to note that extremism always is a rational, relative term. So it has this relation to something. Something's extreme in relation to something other that's predefined. Extremist content can take many very different forms, and there are very multiple different overlapping purposes that social media assumes for extremist. There's no way to talk through all of them today, but just to frame this discussion a bit, I want to mention a few and the most prevalent ones at this stage. Social media is, of course, mostly used to spread the ideological message of the respective extremist group, which can take on any form ranging from memes to short texts and posts to videos and full lecture series. For example, one might think of Anwar al-Awlaki, who was one of the key ideologues of Al-Qaeda before he was killed in a US drone strike in 2011. And had published multiple lecture series on Islamist ideology that were freely available on YouTube. This can be targeted at potential new recruits or to further indoctrinate existing members. Social media also provides violent groups with a powerful mechanism to broadcast their terrorist attacks, beheadings, other violent acts. Most of you will remember the Christchurch attacker who live streamed his murder of 51 people in New Zealand in 2019. At 2 mosques in Christchurch, which was live streamed on Facebook for a total of 17 minutes. And it took another 12 minutes after the attack for the video to be flagged and then taken down. While this type of online content is, of course, mostly geared towards existing like-minded individuals, it can also draw in individuals who just watch these videos because they come across them or because of curiosity, kind of spectators who are then drawn in. Social media is also a key platform to publish and disseminate instructional materials to support extremists in carrying out terrorist attacks. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other groups, for example, will widely share instructions on how to build certain types of bombs, which, for instance, the 2013 Boston Marathon bombers used to build their devices. In this planning stage, social media networks like Telegram, for instance, can also provide semi-secure channels of communication that can be instrumental in planning these attacks. For example, the Paris attackers of 2015 communicated via Telegram to conduct their attacks. Even more diverse than the forms of content extremists post online is the actual substance of their posts. It's almost impossible to cover all extremist ideologies ranging from the far right via Islamist, via misogynistic or single-issue extremism. There are just a few common characteristics that I want to talk about, but there's really no way of generalizing this content across all the different ideologies, so just a brief overview. In addition to opposing a society's core norms and principles, extremist content often exhibits an excessive focus on perceived threats and injustices, which is combined with a frequent demonization and dehumanization of an outgroup. This is often then used to form a sort of collective identity and to form an in-group, or as a motivational frame to call like-minded individuals to action. For example, for right-wing extremists, it would translate to the framing of immigration or Islamization as a threat to national culture or identity, and is often combined with conspiracy theories, in this case, for instance, the Great Replacement theory. And it's also often combined with a persistent negativity, so they're often very much more opposed to something than being for something. Extremist content also frequently calls for a new societal order in reaction to the threats that they have apparently identified, and it's often supposed to be based on national history, culture, or religion. In the case of Islamist extremists, for example, this would be the very frequent reference to the Salafi or the rightly guided pious predecessors whose societal order they want to return to or reestablish. Or as a more recent example, we can think of the Reichsbürger, who are just very much in the news right now, who even have the Reich in their name, the Kaiserreich that they want to return to reestablish, or they believe that still exists. So with this much variance in extremist content online, it's clear that not all social media platforms serve the same purposes or the same groups to the same extent. The largest, more established social media platforms, such as Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter, are often used for the initial contact. The entry threshold is very low, the platforms are free, they're easily accessible, and someone might just stumble upon some sort of extremist content. That's why, for example, groups like Hezbollah have a plethora of Facebook groups that are widely accessible. It's also on these platforms that newly radicalized individuals get drawn progressively further in. And that's a direct consequence of the algorithms used by social media platforms that aim at providing users with content that aligns with their worldview and that reinforces their bias. According to a June 2020 report from the Wall Street Journal, who analyzed an internal Facebook survey of 2016, 64% of all extremist group joins are due to their own recommendation tools. So 64% of the people that joined an extremist Facebook group got there via the recommendation tool of Facebook. Most of those came from the platform's groups you should join or discover algorithms. Therefore, many of the echo chambers prevalent today exist because the largest social media companies designed their platforms to maximize user engagement and ignored the unintended consequences of algorithmic recommendations, ranking, and curation. Increasingly, these social media companies have recognized the problem after their misuse has become known for election manipulation, political violence, and even genocide, if we think of the role of Facebook in the persecution of the Rohingya in Myanmar. Facebook committed, at least nominally, to content moderation and, for example, prohibited posting Holocaust denials. And following the German Network Enforcement Act, social media companies started taking down more and more extremist content. This has led to a considerable reduction of extremist content on the internet. For example, a study by the Leibniz Center for European Economic Research found in an evaluation of 200,000 far-right Twitter accounts that not only the number of extremist posts declined by around 8%, but also that the intensity of the hate that was portrayed in these postings declined. So in this context, we have to consider the second-order effects and take into account the indirect effects of the reduction in intensity, as more extreme posts also gain more visibility and then are shared more frequently. The reduction of extremist content, however, of course, has not eradicated the problem. Many extremists simply moved to different platforms or modified their communication strategies to circumvent prosecution by law enforcement or removal by content moderators. They've done so by using slang, memes, or coded language that's not as easily discernible. Multiple studies on deplatforming found that extremists find alternative networks to disseminate content by the actors whose accounts were deleted in the first place. As larger platforms are increasingly moderating the content and deleting accounts, actors move to different smaller platforms that are less regulated, and Telegram is especially popular in this regard. The app has almost no content moderation, even though that is growing, but also users get push alerts for new posts, and the app provides the option to easily switch between private messaging options and open channels that have an immense reach. Telegram is especially popular with the far right, as a study by the Amadeo Antonio Stiftung, who looked at far-right hate actors, found that 96% of the actors they analyzed were active on Telegram, and many understood the platform to be their communicative base. Other platforms include Parler, which officially tells users to speak freely and express yourself openly without fear of being deplatformed for your views, or GAP, which is particularly used by white supremacists in the US. While the reduction of extremist content overall is definitely a positive, the move to smaller platforms by extremists also harbors the danger that the discussion becomes even more extreme on these niche platforms. We could also talk about Reddit here and smaller, more extreme subreddits. And platforms like Parler or Telegram therefore often play a more significant role further down in the radicalization process. And maybe this also opens up a significant question for regulators. So which kind of extremist content should they tackle, where should they tackle it, and what's sort of the entry point to moderate the extremist content online? And I'm glad to hand over back to Katja and then to my two panelists to talk